Launching a successful attack in chess demands great courage, sense of creativity, and superior positional understanding. Everyone dreams of dragging the enemy monarch down by a series of brilliant sacrifices. And we all love to attack. But attacking even the enemy king is not something you just decide to do. You must have sufficient strategic justification in doing so. Although the excitement that we have towards launching an attack is valid, unfortunately, desire and personal inclination must take a backseat to logic and the ability to read the board correctly. In this video, we'll talk about pawn storms. It is one of the most common ways to directly attack, especially towards the enemy king. A pawn storm happens when a player pushes his connected pawns multiple times in a speedy series of moves to attack the opponent. While pawn storms are fun to play and watch, especially if the player's castle on the opposite sides of the board, one should be careful in the execution. We all know the problem with pawns. They cannot go backwards. So pawn moves must be played with care, because in the event of premature or failed attack, a pawn storm attack may turn into a weakness instead, therefore giving the opponent clear targets of attack. But if used correctly, these marching pawns can turn into monsters that's hard to defend against. Let us check this position. Here, the number of pawns is equal and white is down an exchange. But we can see how the superior kingside pawns of white can do the job of penetrating and even winning the game. Notice how our rook hardly stops a pawn storm here. With after g5, h takes g5, h takes g5, king d7, g6 attacking the rook. Rook needs to move, rook f8, king to f4, c5. Now black tries to counterplay here. After the moves c5, g7, attacking the rook again. Rook to g8, f6, now defending the pawn, and also king e6 to guard this f7 square. King to g5, c4. Now black cannot just try the move king to f7 here because of knight f5, and a fork on h6 will cost black his rook, and that's going to be a free rook here and a queen for white in the next few moves. So this is faster for white. So instead he decided to move his pawn to c4. Then after king g6, white's pawns are just too fast and black is hopeless. Many times pawn storms are so strong, and it happens usually when a player castled in the opposite sides of the board, or when there are multiple pass pawns or connected pass pawns lurking around moving so fast forward. Sometimes it's just when one of them or one of the players pushes his pawns forward only to gain space or to have some insurance in the endgame. There are also times when pawn storms are used to weaken an enemy's pawn structure. So in general and in practical play, how do we play with pawn storms? The answers to this question will be divided into two point of views or POVs: the attacker and the defender. First, for the attacker. An attacker usually creates pawn storms in front of the enemy king with the idea of exchanging those pawns and open a file for the rooks to exploit an attack. In this position, here, white has his rooks positioned on the king side, putting some pressure already on black's king here. Now, the white plays g4. Black replies with h6. Now, h6 here is bad for black, as it allows white to exchange the pawns and opens the file for the rook. After g5, now black cannot prevent an opening of file, because after h takes g5 and h takes g5, we have this h1 rook suddenly becomes active and having a direct access on the territory of black's king. If after g5 moved by white, and black still just decides to move his knight away, for example, knight h5 or knight d7, of course, g takes h6 would open the file. Even if black decides to close the file with the move g6, h5 still allows white to penetrate. And when the files are open, the opportunity for white's attack will overwhelm black in this position. This position again features opposite side castling. In this kind of position, it's usually the attacking speed that matters. White attacks the king side and black attacks the queen side. Here, black appears to be faster and plays b3. This move sacrifices a pawn but opens up a file. If white replies with c takes b3, a takes b3, and a takes b3, the rook on the a file is now open, and still, this just in the previous example, this rook have this instant access to white's king here. If, for example, after c takes b3, a takes b3, and white will just close the position here with a3, this is some kind of the same story, because, at some point, black can even sack a bishop here with bishop takes a3 to launch a devastating attack. And I believe this is a very strong move here. 2 pawns for a bishop and a pass pawn here. In fact, maybe black could have his rooks piled up on this a file, and his queen will help out to attack the white king. And this is a superior position of black in this position. Number 2, when a pawn storm is being launched, sometimes it's for you to create weakness in the enemy pawn structure. If in some instances where opening a file becomes unsuccessful, sometimes an attacker may just take advantage of the weaknesses that will be created out of that pawn storm. Here, white advances his pawn to h6, with an attempt, of course, to open the h file for the rook. And black replies with g6. Now, of course, if black captures the pawn here, it would only help white because, this rook will be open, okay? Or will be in an open file. Now, if after the move g6 by black, now this may have ended all hopes for white's kingside attack. But that pawn on h6 does not become weak or appears to be overextended. Turns out that that pawn even still helps black's king stuck on the corner and even helps weaken the dark square in this area. So in fact, white could force an exchange of dark square bishops in the next move with bishop to c5 to even solidify his edge. After the exchange of bishops here, bishop takes c5, queen takes c5. By the way, in this position, black could not prevent the exchange of the bishops, right? Black has its kingside space reduced after this exchange of bishops here, the dark square bishop, and he needs to keep an eye on his dark square weakness. Here is another example of creating weak squares in your opponent's position through pawn storm. Here, white plays h6 and attempt again to open the h file. Of course, black declines with g6. After the move g6, notice that the f6 square becomes weak. White can then capitalize on that by playing maybe knight to e5, to e4, and knight to f6. And when this knight comes to f6, this is going to be a monster knight posting, an outpost for knight there. And it's going to be a very big plus for white. Here, both kings are castled at the king side. So, logically speaking, a pawn storm on that side of the board may be risking the king to be exposed. So, white storms his pawn here in the queen side instead. This is also known as minority attack here, where a white or a pair of pawns attack 3 pawns of black. The idea behind a minority attack is to push these pawns to create weakness in black's pawn structure. After b5, a takes b5, a takes b5, and white plans to exchange with the c6 pawn next, because after, for example, rook to b8 here, takes, and black has now created a backward pawn on c6. This weak pawn will be new target for white for the rest of the game. Sometimes, pawn storms result to some endgame insurances, especially when the enemy king is far from that side of the board. The position here looks equal. Material is equal, kings are castled kingside, but white sees an opportunity of 3 versus 2 pawns in the queen side here of the board. So now, the queen side of the board here looks like black's king will have a hard time reaching that if this is going to be in the endgame. Imagine if the rooks and queens were gone. This would be easy win for white. So the plan is really to push these pawns forward and try to seize an opportunity to exchange the rook and the queen. So he decided to push his pawns in that side of the board, and he plays g5, b3, and then h5 with the idea of pushing to g4, king to b2, and black will wait for the right timing of the g4 push. Could play maybe queen to g6, queen to f3 if white wants to prevent a push. This pawn will be taken after if that is going to happen. Maybe black could go to rook f7 and so on. Even in the next few moves and in this present position, white has the initiative here, and he also gains the space advantage. And when the endgame comes, this could be the deciding factor. How about in the defender's POV? Now, if you're a defender, how do we deal with pawn storms thrown by an aggressive opponent? Let's get straight to it. First, keep the file closed. If you're a defender and your opponent launches an attack or a pawn storm attack, if your opponent throws pawn storm at you, do not panic. There are effective ways to defend those marching pawns. And one of those ways is keeping the position or the file closed. In other words, see to it that no exchange of pawns will happen, or should we say, no files will be opened. Here, white plays h4. It's not a bad move for black to reply with h5. That seems stopping the threat immediately. But that move weakens the g5 square. And white could even play knight to g5 here, f3 and g4, and still there's a risk of opening the file. And for some players, this is something that is bothering. So instead, the move h6 is more logical. If h5, then g5 closes the file. If white plays g4 here, sacrificing to open the file. Of course, if black captures the pawn, white could try rook g1 here. Now, to some aggressive players, taking the free pawn doesn't do anything. But to some more cautious players, moving the knight here to e8 is more quiet and solid. Because after h5, still we have g5 and closing the file. If g5, then we have h5, still closing the file, and there's nothing white can do to penetrate. Number 2. Another way to deal with pawn storms is to continuously assess the potential drawback of your opponent's marching pawn storm, especially when he launches it prematurely or in a careless way. Let's take a look at this position. In this position, black is under attack here. You can see these pawns trying to move forward here. But notice how his kingside, white's kingside, has been weakened at some point because the king is located in there. So black could take advantage of that by playing maybe knight to e8. Now this is a dual move here because it gives access for queen to go to the king side and also an opportunity to maneuver and go to some weak squares that could be a good outpost for white's knight. Okay, so maybe white could play d4 and black could move his queen to g5, still avoiding the move f4 for white. There's also a plan again, knight c7 to e6 and f4. And for example, if d5, knight f6 again, so black is flexible here. The threat is of course to capture this, because this king's guard in front of him is weak now. Queen to c1, queen to h4 could be played here. Of course, black will not exchange his queen. D takes c6, b takes c6, and white cannot find a way to continue. Black has an insurance here of a draw repetition of moves here after some checks, but still, that is the last thing to do. Here, white seems to be on the hunt of pawn storms, but black has counterplay with queen to b4, taking advantage of the weak f4 pawn. Of course, queen to d2 here is a bad move for white because of this bishop to e3 and earning himself an extra pawn, right? So the best move for white here should be knight to e2, then bishop to e4, threatening the queen, and queen to d2, and it's the same story here. Bishop to e3, maybe rook d6, bishop to f3, and this is going to be knight or this pawn, but white could throw in some skewer move here to rook d3. After knight takes, bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, bishop takes g4, and these pawns become weak. And look at how black managed to get behind the weakness of those marching pawns, or strong pawns or pawn storms that white has thrown in an ineffective way. If the opponent launches a pawn storm attack in the flank, many times the best way to counter it is to attack the center. So another way to deal with attacking pawn storm is to strike at the center, because most of the forces of the enemy are in the flank, and it should leave some weak points at the center. Take note that when your pieces are at the center, they become more powerful than at the sides. So the weight of counter threats placed at the center oftentimes either shifts or lose the opponent's focus towards the center. Then the tables may turn and put the enemy into the defensive end. Let us take a look at this position here. If in this position, white plays g4. Now, launching a pawn storm attack on the king side. Now, instead of acting like a sitting duck, black reacts by striking at the center with d5. If g5, d takes e4, g takes f6, queen takes d3, f takes g7, rook d8. Now, black's king did not capture the pawn on g7 to keep the file closed, and that is for his safety. Bishop takes h6, bishop takes f5. Now, notice how black transformed the position into his favor, and look at how you saw how the pawn storms that once white has managed to launch are gone now, and still this is a strong kingside for black to be penetrated by the opponent. And there you go. I hope you learn about dealing with and against pawn storms. When it comes to pawn storms, it's really important to develop the skill to know the right timing of moving the pawns forward, so to avoid weakness in one's side and maximize the advantage that it brings. If you learned a lot from this video, please click like and subscribe button for more chess videos. And don't forget to also click that notification bell so you get updates when we upload more chess lessons for you.
Hey, check this video out to make sure that you get more important information to bring your chess to the next level.